Hello everyone, no one cares how tired you are. My name is Darren McGarvey, welcome to Darren McGarvey's Common People. Now, a few days ago I came down here at the green room to record an episode for you guys, which was all about the latest stupid thing that now former Home Secretary Suella Braverman said. And in that video, I said she's known for saying stupid things. She regularly says them. It's all part of her strategy to appeal to the hard right of the party, which is what empowered her in the first place. Rishi Sunak, so politically weak, had to install her as Home Secretary in order to resolve internal conflicts within his ridiculous political party. And this has been the pattern for all Conservative Prime Ministers for a very, very, very long time. So the latest stupid thing that she said was that homeless people are making a lifestyle choice to stay on the streets. And so in the video, I was breaking down how she's kind of right, but not in the way that she thinks. And so I alluded to the fact that there is a very, very small minority of rough sleepers who have been sleeping rough for so long and are so embedded within a very marginalised, persecuted community of other homeless people, that actually the gravity of the social connection and the fact that they can get their immediate needs met in that very marginalised community will often present to somebody looking on from a distance as a choice to sleep rough. I have spoken to homeless people who have been offered accommodation or other forms of support, and actually for them, from their perspective, sleeping on the streets, begging, and all of the other stuff that goes with sleeping rough, that seems like the simpler choice. And that's partly because they've been living that life for so long that the idea of having a higher level of culpability and responsibility and being isolated within an unfamiliar place like a supported accommodation or a new flat or whatever just seems very, very daunting. And this is testament not to the exhibition of free will that is making a choice to sleep rough, but actually to the lack of choice, because for it to be a true choice, there has to be more than one terrible option available. So in that video, then I elaborated on the fact that this was all part of Suella Braverman's strategy to be so provocative that Rishi Sunak would eventually be confronted with the option of sacking her, thus making her a political martyr, thus allowing her to take advantage of this very limited window about a year out from a general election where she can agitate for the leadership of the Conservative Party and truly allow some of those hard right forces to reveal themselves. And what do you know? I even said in the video, it's times like this you miss David Cameron, and what a fucked up time to be in politics when you're saying something like that. Of course, lo and behold, the next day we woke up, Cameron was back as Foreign Secretary, Braverman was sacked. And so it was a mixture of emotions. Covering current affairs is very difficult because 24 hours can actually make your video redundant. So I'm starting to really understand why people do this shit live. But I think actually this brings me on to a wider point. And the wider point is the fact that clearly we see in David Cameron and Suella Braverman two very distinct types of Conservative. Now, from the left, we generalise a lot about Tories, we generalise a lot about conservatism, conservative beliefs, conservative politics. And I think that stuff plays well on Facebook to the tribe when we're preaching to the choir of converts. But in this current time, this current political moment, where there is volatility, not just at the level of domestic politics, but volatility at the level of global politics, I think it's important that we make more careful distinctions between different types of conservative figures. There is the ideal scenario, which I'm sure many of you watching would prefer, which is we just had no Tories. We just had no Conservative government. Unfortunately, the reality of the situation is this. We have a Conservative government, and as long as there is an opportunity for them to try and consolidate whatever little bit of influence that they've got, to try and cling to power for its own justification rather than because they have any long-term vision of a society, then they will do that. And that will continue to happen, and that has been the case in the UK for the last 100 years. So in a scenario like that, sometimes we've got to set aside what the ideal situation is, and we've got to look and say, in the privacy of our own mind, were many of us actually bizarrely comforted by the sight of David Cameron returning to Downing Street? And I am ashamed to say that I was. Now, why is that? David Cameron is, after all, a co-architect of austerity. Him, George Osborne, and that guy Nick with the annoying face from the Lib Dems, who now works for Facebook. They brought forward the harshest public sector cuts of any advanced economy in response to a financial crisis that was created by wealthy bankers and speculators. This led to welfare reforms, which have been associated with the deaths of 130,000 people, many of them disabled people. And this also led to public sector cuts, which created a deep reservoir of resentment, which became prime fertile ground for far-right agitators like Nigel Farage, Katie Hopkins, Tommy Robinson, to really stoke those flames of xenophobia, of racism, which ultimately created the conditions that we are in now, partly. So we're in a situation now where Conservative policy creates fractures in communities, cuts in public services, and high levels of chronic stress, which then makes people more vulnerable to that emotional temperament where you're feeling very annoyed by things. You feel like someone else is to blame for your problems. And then a far-right figure comes, wraps up in a nice, simple little bow and tells you, here, these brown people coming in these boats, it's their fault. So you see that actually conservatism actually breeds more conservatism. So what is the latest iteration of this? The latest iteration of this is Rishi Sunak having just been denied the opportunity to stick refugees on planes and send them to an authoritarian country in Rwanda, which has been deemed by the Supreme Court as unsafe. He's decided the party of law and order are just going to change the law because they don't like that. Why is he doing this? He's doing this because he's made a pledge to do it. And even though the pledge was unworkable, and even though the pledge was unrealistic, he has to then make another pledge in order to secure that demographic of people who have been told that the solution to the problems of their life is to stop people from coming here, fleeing difficulties in other countries, difficulties that our foreign policy or economic policy are often really underscoring. This is the madness of conservatism currently. But what I will say is that while we're often focused on the domestic politics, we've also got to take into consideration when we're looking at who is in Downing Street and who's sitting around that cabinet table, that currently, given what is going on, not only in Ukraine, but now in Palestine, we're on the lower slopes of something potentially graver than just the mere circus of Tories in the UK. And I think if I can refer you back to the pandemic, where we had Boris Johnson in power, where even in the inquiry into COVID, his own team were saying he was the wrong Prime Minister for that sort of crisis. We have to try and hold in our minds not just why someone's in power to deal with the political situation at domestic level, but also imagine suddenly we were in a global situation. What sort of voices would we want around that cabinet table in an unideal scenario where it's a bunch of public-schooled Tories? I, for one, would prefer David Cameron around that table than Suella Braverman. Why do I say that? I say that because whatever his beliefs, whatever his record, he has insight into the various levels of governance that dictate how decisions are taken at that level. And that has to be in the plus column, where you've got someone like Suella Braverman, who no one had heard of until, you know, a couple of years ago. And you have a bunch of lightweights like Grant Shapps and Robert Jenrick and Steve Barclay and Esther McFucking-Vey. Can you imagine when the fucking NATO nuclear codes are coming into Downing Street, when it's really, really kicking off, that someone has to turn around and ask for Esther McVeigh's opinion on what is to happen? I, for one, think that is absolutely mental. So on the left, we have always said Tories this, Tories that, all Tories are scum. But also, if we look at it, we've seen the recent trend has been that prior Conservative figures have been rendered by the passage of time and the slow degradation in the quality of leadership as we have marched on as not quite as bad in the past as what we currently have. And so, in a situation like that, which is not ideal, as I say, then I think in order to be taken seriously when we're making arguments against Conservative policy, Conservative ideology, this whole tarring all Tories with the same brush, I don't think is a very serious way for us to conduct ourselves. Now, I'm not David Cameron's biggest fan. I've written extensively over the years across 2 books, 9 television programmes and various other public events, in strong opposition to Conservative social policy, Conservative economic policy. But in this particular time in history, while our volatilities at various levels, then somebody who has a calm temperament, somebody who is in some ways very, very predictable, I think having them around the cabinet table and the Prime Minister maybe being able to turn to them for a bit of advice is not necessarily a bad thing. I'll just leave it there for today, folks. Hope you're having a good time. Don't forget to like and subscribe and tune in for the next episode soon. Take it easy.